evening. My name is Amir Avivi. I'm the CEO of Protectors of Israel, of a Bitchonisti movement. Our organization has more than 1,400 high-ranking officers, commanders, and operators. We are happy to host this webinar today and talk about the future of the Palestinian Authority after Abbas. I'm honored to have you, Caroline Glick, with us today. Usually you are a panelist and an expert, but today we asked you to interview our guests and use your expertise. So having said that, I will pass it to you, and I'm sure everybody will enjoy this very interesting session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amir, and thank you, Yossi. Cooper-Wasser is here from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Yossi is a retired brigadier general, who's in charge of the IDF's intelligence assessment branch, and Shimrit Meir is a very prominent commentator, very acutely aware of what's happening in Palestinian society, and will soon be joined by Dr. Moti Kedar from Bar Ilan, who's one of Israel's premier experts on the Palestinian society. We're having this panel today for two reasons. One is, here's Moti, hi. We're having this panel for two reasons now. One is because of the profound impact that the Abraham Accords are having on the region, and specifically on the position of the Palestinians. For going on 70 years, they've had veto power over much of the over attempts to make peace with Israel or to end the Arab world's conflict with Israel, and they've been given sort of a carte blanche to block that, certainly for the past 50 years. And now with the Abraham Accords, that's basically gone. And so we want to talk about that. We want to talk about that with the Palestinian Authority really now very much on the verge of what may very well be, we're going to discuss this, what will likely occur after its longtime leader, Mahmoud Abbas, leaves the scene. He's old and he's ill, and he's never appointed a successor. So we're going to be talking about what's happening in the Palestinian Authority, what's likely to happen there in light of the Abraham Accords diminishment of the role of the Palestinians in the Middle East, and also in light of Abbas's likely departure in the foreseeable future. And then second, of course, we're going to be looking at it in light of the fact that we have a great big question mark staring down at us, which is what's going to be the results of the US presidential elections that are going to be taking place the day after tomorrow. And, so that really speaks to the question of how strong, how powerful the change has been as a result of the Abraham Accords that have brought normalization agreements between Israel and three Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan, what they portend for the future, and how the possibility of a Democratic administration led by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris may or may not change that. And finally, I want to end it with a question about Israel and what Israel's should be doing regardless of who is in the White House in terms of its position on the Palestinian Authority, and specifically in terms of securing its interests in Judea and Samaria. So with that, I want to start, I want to open it up now by posing the question to Moti, since you've just joined us. I want to ask you, how do you see the impact of the Abraham Accords on the region, and specifically on the Palestinians? I mean, short answer. And I know you could give me a 3-hour lecture on this, and it would be riveting. But we want to, try to cover a lot of issues here. So I want to just sort of get a brief encapsulation of how the Abraham Accords have impacted the Palestinians' regional positioning, and also how they've impacted Israel's ability to achieve its interests in Judea and Samaria and secure its interests vis-a-vis the Palestinians and vis-a-vis Judea and Samaria. So if you can boil that incredibly large question into some concrete points that we can use to sort of pivot off, it'd be great.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Whenever I have to put something in a concise way, I quote what happens in the Arab world, because these people use, the real expression, in order to express what they want. The expression which you can find today in the Arab media, especially in those countries which normalize their relations with us, is that we are all on the train going forward while the Palestinians remained on the track. They had the chance to come on the train, but either they didn't buy a ticket or they decided for their own reasons to stay on the track. And the train has left the station and we are going forward, and the Palestinians remain there in order to whine over their fate, why they didn't climb the train and join the group. And this is actually how the Middle East, means at least the part of the Middle East which goes with us, looks at the Palestinians as some people who remain in the left, remain in the past, still whining about Palestine after they sold Palestine to the Jews. And they are, people say that they are not even Arabs. They are all kinds of remnants of all kinds of peoples who moved in this country, Cherkess and Bosnians and others. And they really, I would say, make fun out of Palestinians in a degree that the Palestinians really feel it. And I think that the Palestinian Authority, means the body which actually resembles the Palestinian nationalism, now remained with absolutely no message to their own people, who actually are laughing at those lunatics who still are talking about Arab nationalism when the Arab nationalism is on the train with Israel, and who knows in what kind of a track or what kind of a car.
So Shimrit, if I can just ask you, because I know that you're paying a lot of attention to what the Palestinians say on social media. And so I was wondering what kind of voices are being heard? Are they angry? Are they confused? What sort of legitimacy do they feel that the PA has, the PLO has, or the Hamas has, or how are they looking at this? Because really their world has in many ways been turned upside down. They always thought that time was on their side, that they never had to change, that they were the power brokers, that everybody would do what they said. And now, as Moti said, people are just laughing at them. What kind of voices are you hearing on social media from the Palestinians, and what sort of things what are the main themes that really have been, striking to you over the past month or two since the Abraham Accords sort of bought their tickets and got on the train?
So I think the loudest voice is actually the silence, or the relative silence, that this was accepted both in the Arab world. We did not see mass demonstration, not in Cairo, not in the UAE, not in Bahrain. There was some marginal things or gatherings, not in even Jordan and elsewhere. So we just saw the general indifference that the Arab public opinion or Arab discourse is, acted in throughout the last 4 years of Trump. In terms of the Palestinian discourse, you could have thought that such a blow, not only by the American administration, but from their own brothers, Arab brothers, will force them to do what they avoided doing at all costs, which is recalculate or rethink or think, what did we do wrong, or where are we going from here, or re-examine the national program, or even seriously rethinking their unity, or the fact that there are two Palestinian entities rather than one. None of this is happening in a large scale or profoundly. It's all really on the surface. Abbas is being criticized for many things, many things in the Palestinian, let's say, conversation on social media, because of course this is not a democracy in the sense of free speech, and it was further limited, you know, in the recent 5 years or so. You can literally go to prison for posting the wrong thing on Facebook, but nonetheless, Abbas is still being criticized from the Palestinian diaspora and from within, the way they refer to it in Arabic, but not on this, because his strategy in regards to the Trump administration was almost seeing it as a force majeure. There is nothing really we can do about this, but you know, sumud, which is stand on our ground and you know, stand by our principles and not give in. And as far as the Arabs and their betrayal or stab in the back, there is only so much we can do. So they might have described it as the second Nakba, but really there is very little that he was asked to do or challenged with in the conversation. I think to an extent, the policy of boycotting the Trump administration and just waiting it out was one of his only policies that was actually embraced and supported by his people. So, and on the other hand, you don't see rage. And you didn't see rage, not when the embassy was moved, and not when, you know, things much more dramatic took place. So you see kind of the general situation within the Palestinian territories, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, is of a long wait for something dramatic to shift. And the something dramatic that we were talking about in the last, you know, many years is Abbas's departure, both naturally or politically or other. But Abbas is, you know, is 84, but is still there, and nothing profound can shift politically when he's still there, on one hand, and on the other hand, the various players that would maybe naturally challenge him are thinking of him as a problem that might solve itself naturally soon. So everything is kind of on hold, including the Palestinian split and lack of unity. And the Trump thing, they see it almost as a superpower or some kind of, you know, divine punishment that will go away eventually. And I think that even before the change before COVID, and when it was really very likely that Trump will get a second term, the Palestinian strategy or tactic rather was to wait it out and, you know, find some comfort in the more sympathetic or empathetic voices within the Democratic Party and natural supporters such as the EU, and believe that the pendulum will eventually go back to their side.
So, you know, I mean, it's interesting what you say, and I want to flip this back to Moti and Yossi, but I think a couple of weeks ago, Ehud Yari, who's another one of our prominent commentators on the Arab world in Israel, he noted some data from surveys of the youth in the Arab world, in Arab states and in the Palestinian Authority. And I think what was most notable, and I wish that I had looked this over before we started this evening, but there were very large proportions of the youth of these societies that want to emigrate, and the Palestinian Authority areas were no different. And this jibed with historical numbers that I've seen over the past decade and a half, where they're talking about up to you know, over 50% of young Palestinians wanting to leave. And I think that part of the thing that I'm hearing with Shimrit, aside from, you know, they're waiting and hoping that the pendulum will you know, move back to where it was before, Trump is just going to be a bleep on the radar and everything will go back to normal and they'll get their veto back. there's also seems to be a profound apathy among Palestinians that they wouldn't respond in some sort of a dramatic way, either against Israel or against their leadership or against the Arab world, or in some other way. And we haven't really seen that. It's been a very muted response from the public. And this leads me to the real question. It seems to me one of the things that's arising also, both because of the Abraham Accords and also because of the sort of fragmentation and apathy that we're seeing expressed among Palestinians, is really a dwindling relevance of the Palestinian Authority as an actor. And you know, that speaks to how are we looking at it? Because it seems to me, Yossi, that, for instance, in the IDF, there doesn't seem to be a recognition of the fragmentation of the Palestinian society and of the dwindling legitimacy and even relevance of the Palestinian Authority as a governing system or government leading the Palestinians forward. And I'm wondering, A, why this is, and B, what has to happen for the Israeli leadership, particularly the security leadership, to kind of look at the Palestinians anew. I mean, we saw a question that was posed to us just now while Shamir was talking about Mohammed Dakhlan, who's a senior advisor in the UAE, and he had been a senior security boss in Fatah in the Gaza Strip, and whether he's going to come in and change everything and become some sort of a dramatic and purposeful new leader who's going to lead the Palestinians again, and they're going to turn into an important thing again, or whether there's any sense of, you know, sort of the disintegration of that kind of political relevance of the Palestinian Authority.
Oh, good evening. I'd say just the opposite. The situation is that the security establishment in Israel is aware of the weakening of the Palestinian Authority, both in the region and in the Palestinian communities and the society itself. They are aware of it. The problem is that they are scared about it. They don't want it to happen.
Okay, can I rephrase my question then, just so that we don't go a flight? Let me rephrase it and say, what is it that makes them want it to be important? I mean, this is an authority that is an enemy of Israel, that is organized around a principle of fighting Israel. And, you know, what has to change for that perspective to change?
Well, they don't understand it. They don't take the PA as an enemy. We have to understand it. For them, the PA is at worst a frenemy, a friend and an enemy. And they definitely feel that they need the PA in order to provide security and to avoid the need to get involved in providing for the Palestinians on civilian matters and to clean the streets of Ramallah. So since they are afraid this is going to be very costly, also strategically, but from a pure security point of view, they prefer to make sure that the PA is able to stay in place. And you just look at it, the Palestinian Authority doesn't want to take the money that we collect for it, its money, from Israel. Israel is going out of its way in order to convince the Palestinians to take the money. Israel has adopted the law in spite of the government that says that it will not give money for the Palestinians to deduct the sums they use in order to pay salaries to terrorists. It will be deducted from the money delivered to the Palestinians. The government doesn't find the time to discuss how much money is it and therefore how much money they should deduct. It's crazy. And because they don't see it, you can hear the people from the security establishment repeatedly saying, oh, Abu Mazen is a man of peace. Abu Mazen is against terror. Nonsense. Abu Mazen is totally committed to the annihilation of the state of Israel, and in stages. That's the nice thing about him. And he's not against terror. He thinks terror is legitimate. But at this point of time, the best way of committing terror activities is through what he calls popular resistance, namely without the use of explosives and firearms. If you just use cars ramming and things like that, it's all right. Definitely Molotov cocktails and the stones thrown. That's just fine. But this is, and what is the problem with the Palestinians today? They are afraid of the decline of the entire narrative, because they thought that they should be committed to destroying Zionism. And here comes the Arab world and tell them, listen, there's nothing so bad with Zionism. We can actually cooperate with the Zionists. We can rely on the Zionists in order to fight our real enemies like the Iranians and others. Why won't you change your narrative and try to work with the Zionists? And what is so dangerous for the Palestinians is that when they really need the Zionists, like in the case of Saeb Erekat, they do use the Zionists. So this makes the entire argument so unacceptable for anybody. And this is the weakness of the Palestinian Authority. We are waiting for anybody from the Palestinian leadership to rise up and say, listen, with everything that's happening, it's time for some soul searching. We lost the Arabs. We have to, we got stuck on the track when the train left. What do we do when the next train comes? That's something that we should think about. But with the really very few exceptions, like Sari Nusseibeh and others, most of them are committed to the narrative, and they wait for Biden to allow them to go back there. Again, misunderstanding, as they totally misunderstood the move towards normalization, and they don't understand that the situation now is irreversible. There's no way back. Even if Biden comes, it's not going. It's impossible to go back to where we were before Trump, because the embassy is not going back. The UAE, Sudan, and the Bahrain are not going to cut relations with Israel just because Biden is coming back. The terrible thing that happened to them was that if it was, the choice was between extending sovereignty or normalization. If we were eventually going to extend sovereignty, the Palestinians were ready to this battle. It was a very bitter battle, but they were ready for that, and they would believe that in this battle, the Arabs, the Europeans, the Democrats in the United States would be on their side. But now they are engaged in a battle in which they don't have any friends, because nobody can speak anything against normalization, not the Democrats in the States, not the Europeans, and definitely the Arabs are doing it, so they definitely are not speaking against it. So it's a very, they're caught in a lost position, and we just have to wait until after the elections, when they realize that there's no way back. Then I guess, I hope somebody will start saying something different there. The security establishment in Israel, I don't have any expectations from them. They are in a lost case, and just like the Palestinians. I don't think they're going to change their attitude. And look, we have no security cooperation with the Palestinians and no civilian cooperation with the Palestinians for, I don't know, something like 6 months now. What happened? Nothing. It's nice to have this cooperation, but I'm totally in favor of it, but it's not something that we are that reliant on. We can live without it. And as time goes by, this is becoming more and more clear to everybody, with the exception of the Palestinians and the Israeli security establishment.
So, here, let me bring this question and then to you, Moti, again. I mean, why, or let's put it this way. So you have two very central actors here, the Israeli military establishment, which is in charge so long as Israel hasn't applied its civilian laws to Judea and Samaria in all or in parts. They're in charge of running for the Israeli government our policy in Judea and Samaria on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have Palestinian society that seems to be insusceptible to new information, and that they just are closed off to it. As Shimrit was explaining to us, they're waiting for the other shoe to drop and for things to go back to normal. And so there are two real questions here, and they're both, again, I keep giving you huge ones and then telling you, give me short answers so that we can go on. I know that's not fair, but the two big questions are, what should Israel be doing now, looking at this fragmented Palestinian society and the growing irrelevance of the Palestinian Authority, whether they want to recognize it or not? And in a way, the growing irrelevance of what Israeli military commanders say, because they're saying things that are wrong. What should an Israeli policy look like towards the Palestinians now, towards the Palestinians generally, the Palestinians, towards the Palestinian Authority? Are there people for Israel to base a new position towards the Palestinians on? How do you identify them? If there aren't, should we care? And then, the other question, actually, I'll leave the other question for the last round that we're going to be discussing going forward with either the same, God willing, friendly American administration under Trump or a very unfriendly one under Joe Biden, but we'll do that in the last round. So just, how are we supposed to be looking at this situation? What are our possibilities for moving forward?
Well, first of all, we Israelis have to start thinking out of the box, which goes nowhere. This box, which we built, means the Palestinian Authority as a kind of solution and a partner for everything. Turned out that this is something which doesn't work. It doesn't work. They are detached from the people. And when we say Palestinians, we always have to, what do you mean? You mean the men in the street, or you mean the corrupt, dysfunctional organization named the PA? And what we have to do is actually go to the first step and to realign ourselves with the real power on the ground. Because the real powers on the ground are the clans. And the clans are there from time immemorial, and they will stay forever, regardless of who runs the place, whether it's Jordan or Israel or the PA, because the clans are actually the society of the Arabs who live in Judea and Samaria. And they are there forever. They have the legitimacy, they have the leadership, and they know what is good for them. And this is why Israel made a giant mistake by bringing this gang of terrorists from Tunisia 26 years ago in order to take care, for Arafat to take care of the Hamas and the jihad, the Islamic Jihad, without Bagatz and without B'Tselem. So we have to realign ourselves with the people on the ground, means to recognize the power, the existence, and the ability of the clans on the ground to run their life as it is in the Emirates, in the Gulf, as it is in Bahrain, as it is in Bahrain less, but Qatar definitely, because all these countries are homogeneous countries with one leading clan in each and every one of them. Means Kuwait, for example, is Al Sabah. Qatar is Al Thani. Al means family. Abu Dhabi is Al Nihyan, and so forth. Every emirate like Dubai, Sharjah, whatever, they have one leading family, and therefore the regime is legitimate. Unlike the PA, which we brought in order to serve us. So they are initially not legitimate. So, and this is actually what divides the Arab world today to dysfunctional countries and countries which work. Because the dysfunctional countries are conglomerates, heterogeneous conglomerates of clans, of ethnic groups like Kurds and Arabs, religious and sectarian groups, while the successful countries are actually homogeneous, built on the culture of the Middle East, not on socialism or nationalism or all kinds of other isms which were brought from the West, which do not fit the Arab societies here in the Middle East. And therefore, we have to emulate the formula which works in the Middle East, which is the Emirates. And here I would like to show what I mean by Palestinian Emirates. Here I am, and I am sharing it with you guys. This is the map of the Palestinian Emirates. First of all, one emirate exists already in Gaza for 13 and a half years since Hamas took this area over. And we have to live with this, to recognize it as a state, and to make sure that they live aside to us, in whatever we can achieve, a ceasefire, armistice, or whatever. I don't believe that they would like to have any peace with Israel because they are Hamas. As long as Hamas is there, and I don't see anyone in the world who comes to take them out, we have to recognize them as a state and tell them be very careful from us. And to continue, and by the way, the Hamas actually fragmented the Palestinian Authority already 13 and a half years ago. We are not committed to keep it alive and to resuscitate this dysfunctional entity. Therefore, we have to go to the clans of Hebron, the Jabri, Kawas, Menache, Tamimi, Abu Snena clans, and to tell them, hey guys, this is your emirate, take care of yourself, we'll help you whatever you need, and sit with us, and whatever you need, we are with you. And then you have to go to the Arikat clan of Jericho and tell them the same. And if Saib Arikat survives, he can be the king because it's actually the king of these people. And whatever you need, let us know, we'll give you if you need. Ramallah, the Barghouti, and the Abu Ain, and the Tawil, the leading clans of Ramallah, and so forth with the leading clans of Nablus, Masri, Tukan, and Shaka, and so forth in Kalkilia, in Tulkarem with the Karmis and Jenin. Israel should forever remain in the rural areas and offer Israeli citizenship to the villagers, which are around 15% of the population. It's not a demographic threat on Israel. We can absorb it because we have all the space between the Emirates. Israel should have relations with every emirate separately. If they want to have a federation, let them have a federation. We'll deal with this as well. But this is the only thing which works in the Middle East. For example, the United Arab Emirates, while states like Syria are failing states. If we build a whole Palestinian state based on all these multiple clans, this thing will come to the end of Syria or Iraq or Libya.
So
inevitably.
Okay, so all right, just building off of that, I mean, Shimrit, when you look at what's happening in Gaza, for instance, with Hamas, how are the Palestinians in Gaza, are the people of Gaza, do they feel comfortable with Hamas as their leaders? How stable is Hamas's rule as you see it in Gaza? And when you hear Moti talk about the various clans in Judea and Samaria and the Palestinian population centers, do you see people, in your experience, is that something that people among the Palestinians would be an authentic presentation of their identity to them?
Well, in terms of, the internal social fabric in the Palestinian society, I just heard Moti, and that sounds like a lot of micromanaging. And I think that the Israeli system that Yossi described, or the Israeli military establishment, finding it hard to navigate between two Palestinian entities, i.e. the one in Gaza and the one in the West Bank, let alone micromanage every single little.
But I don't really. I mean, I don't want to get into a dispute about it. And I actually want to get into the question about the merits. So let me just make the question a little bit clearer. I think that one of the things that Moti was saying was that this is organic. That this isn't about Israel micromanaging anybody. This is just the way that people organize in a sort of natural familial kind of way in the various population centers in Judea and Samaria. And so I didn't get the sense that this was a micromanagement issue. It was more of a question of how do people express themselves? How do they see themselves?
No, I just want to reiterate on this, because at the moment what the PA is failing to be a process towards statehood, clearly, is the way that the Israeli military or the Israeli state outsources managing the Palestinian society or micromanaging the Palestinian society. I.e., for example, from recently, during the COVID-19 crisis, there were many problems in Hebron, for example, precisely because of this. Very tribal mentality when you really needed something coherent in terms of behavior and authority, etc., etc. And the Palestinian Authority really struggled with it. So what I'm saying is that the structure that Moti described is indeed the structure. However, do we want to deal with this ourselves, or do we want to also outsource? And I think that's and B, to your question, which I think is very important regarding Gaza, because we tend to really neglect the fact that there is a fundamental obstacle towards a Palestinian statehood, and that there is Gaza, i.e. half of the Palestinian population is living under a different regime. Now, technically, Yahya Sinwar, that is the head of Hamas in Gaza, he is controlling it. He seized power, and there is no internal real challenge on his authority. Because of his past in a military wing, he is able to enforce his view on the military wing and on the political system and navigate between them and manage things on the ground. He is now managing the process of some kind of prolonged ceasefire with Israel. I'm saying ceasefire, but this can flame up in a matter of days. And we can definitely see some days of escalation during November even. But generally speaking, Gaza is held tightly by Hamas. However, and I think that's very important when we talk about the day after, because one of the main concerns of Israelis about the day after is, will Hamas try and make a move on the West Bank to seize the power and consolidate power on the two territories and power over the Palestinian national project? I think most of the people in the West Bank, when they look at the 12 years of Hamas's experience in Gaza, they look at it and say, okay, no thanks. We don't want that. We saw what the Mukawama experiment looks like now. We have a real life evidence, and we might not like the PA and how our lives look, but we definitely don't want that. And Hamas is extremely weak militarily in the West Bank at the moment because of joint efforts by the IDF and the Palestinian security establishment and the cooperation. But that is not to say that once they will be allowed, they will find the resources from Turkey, from elsewhere, and become strong again. And Hamas still has the civilian infrastructure in the West Bank. But I do think that once you as in Hamas, will try to go for the trophy, say to the Palestinian people, we are ready to lead, people will look at your experience in Gaza and will question that. And I think that is part of the reason why Yahya Sinwar tries to stabilize the situation there and basically create a similar model to the one of the PA, heavily relying on external financial support, not deciding anything politically, creating ongoing hudna, a ceasefire, long-term with Israel, not giving up any of his ideas in terms of long-term liberating Palestine, building power, etc., etc. And I think to an extent, Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, is the real heir of Yasser Arafat. He's from the other party, but in terms of using both military or terrorism and talks and not giving up on anything and living from day to day. And by the way, in terms of a Biden administration, I don't think that the train has left the station. I do hear from various people in DC that we are going to see some even immediate steps that will ensure that will send a signal that something changed, that things are not the same, whether it is renewing the financial aid to the Palestinians, even to UNRWA, reinstating the, yeah.
No, I think you're right about that, and I think that there is something that we have to look at here, and I wanted to bring this over to Yossi. I mean, there are a couple of things here that sort of arise from what Shimrit and Moti have been saying, and I think one of the ones that sort of that arises very clearly from what Moti says is that if left to their own devices, right, this is sort of how things would organize themselves among the Palestinians. We did a terrible job trying to micromanage them when we brought in the PLO in 1994. And we, of course, did a terrible job of micromanaging them. And we thought that it would be a great idea to back Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, against the PLO and Fatah in the 1980s. And so, we don't bet on good horses. And so the real question is, assuming for a second, just for the purpose of argument, that Moti's assessment of the political organization among Palestinians is correct, and that if left to their own devices, they would prefer to organize around clan leaderships in various areas and traditional leaders along the lines of the United Arab Emirates. There are so many other forces that are acting upon the Palestinians. I think you would agree, if I were to argue, as I have in the past, that the EU plays a huge role in maintaining the PLO. They have a thumb very firmly on the scales in favor of the Palestinians against Israel for various political reasons. Turkey is in here. The United States, obviously, the identity of the next president is very, very central to this. So what can Israel do to kind of, to try to make things less susceptible to outsiders coming in and changing things, and perhaps including ourselves? I mean, how do you see this playing out in general? Can we push away the outside world from this? Can we not? Should we be trying to do one thing and not the other, regardless of who's president, whether it's Trump, who wants to make a deal and is pushing really hard and wants the PLO to make it, or a Biden administration that the first thing that he does the first day he gets into office is reopen the Palestinian diplomatic legation in Washington, D.C. and reinstate U.S. funding to the PLO? I mean, how should we be looking at this?
I think that we shouldn't argue with the fact that there is a Palestinian people. And when we look at the Palestinian people, we have to understand that beyond those families and clans that Moti was talking about, there are a huge amount of descendants of the refugees that live amongst the people of Gaza and live amongst the people of the West Bank. And so it's a very complicated issue. On top of that, we have to keep in mind that the incitement and the brainwashing that these people have been exposed to for so long, and the fact that they live in some sort of a cognitive dissonance between, on the one hand, this incitement and the brainwashing tells them the hate indoctrination should tell them they should hate the Israelis, and the most important thing they have to be committed to is the battle against Zionism until its demise. But at the same time, if they look at the way this both Gaza and the PA are functioning, they also balance between this commitment to the ongoing battle and the need to have normal lives. So it's some cognitive dissonance here. If you are so committed to the battle, why do you pay so much attention to the quality of life? This is a very difficult situation. We have to let the Palestinians cook in their own juices before anything changes. And what we have to focus on is on changing the conditions around this cooking pot, and the way we do it, we have to change some of the rules of the game. We would like to change many rules of the game, like the European assistance to the Palestinians, like the attitude of the Democrats to the Palestinian issue. We would like to change this. We invest a lot in trying to explain to them who are the Palestinians and what are they actually trying to achieve. But the rule of the game that we have managed to change, and we have to go farther with that, is the rule of the game that says that there cannot be normal relations between Israel and the Arab world unless we succumb to all the Palestinian demands. Well, this rule we have changed forever. It's not going to come back. And we have to join hands with those who are already on this train, as Moti called it, and bring more people to this train, like Saudi Arabia, like Oman, like Morocco. If we manage to do that, and President Trump has said that there are 5, maybe 10 countries that want to join in, if we manage to do that, then this is going to put so much pressure on the Palestinians so that the changes inside the Palestinian society are going to be even more necessary. And we have to, what we want to make the Palestinians realize eventually is that quality of life is more important than fighting against Israel. If this is going to happen to the Palestinians by themselves, if we can bring the Democrats or if we can bring the Americans, doesn't matter if it's Democrats or Republicans, to put pressure on the Palestinians to make this change, this is what we need to do. Listen, Obama, when he was speaking to the Palestinians from Binyanei Ha'uma in Jerusalem, he told them, listen, you have to accept that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. And here, for the first time, the United Arab Emirates are saying that there is a Jewish people. You know, this is something immense. For the Palestinians to hear that some Arabs are ready to accept the fact that there is a Jewish people, which means that they have a right for a state of their own. And this state may be in what they call Palestine, what we call Eretz Israel, is something that is unbelievable. This is the most important pillar of the Palestinian narrative, that there is no Jewish people. This is the base for the entire Palestinian charter, national charter. So this is something that is immense for the Palestinians, and we have to let them comprehend that things have changed. Now,
it's really strange to me, in fact, what you were just saying. I mean, they don't, what Shimrit was saying is really kind of stunning. I mean, it seems like they're not listening, you know, because when the Arab Spring happened, what's called the Arab Spring, when all the revolutionary movements started going on, you had, for a while, for a couple of years, we had a very profound response of the Arab Israelis in particular to what was going on throughout the Arab world. They wanted to join the army, in the Israeli army. They wanted to be in national service. They were rethinking their views of Israel for the first time because they saw that the Arab world was falling apart. And here, the Arab world again is changing, and it's changing by embracing Israel. Very large swaths of it are, and it doesn't seem like there's any sort of real.
No, there is, Caroline, there is. Look at what's happening inside the Palestinian, inside the Arab list in Israel. There's a rift between those who are saying, okay, things are changing, we have to change too. It's Mansour, for example, is cooperating with Likud. It's because he says that the most important thing is the quality of life for the Arabs living in Israel. And this is one of the first signs of change inside the Palestinian community. Whereas
I'm talking about the Palestinian. I'm talking about the Palestinian.
I'm talking now about the Arab Israelis, but I think that what's happening inside the Arab Israeli community is going to have some impact on what's happening in the Palestinian street, because some people are courageous enough to say, "Listen, something has happened. We have to make some adjustments." Now, in the past, the way the Palestinians handled these situations was with tactical changes. They never changed the goal. And I'm sure that for the time being, they will try to make only tactical changes. But the intensity of the change that happened here is so immense that maybe tactical changes are not going to be enough. And it takes time for things like that to happen. You know, after 73, the Palestinians, what have they done? They've adopted the 74 phases theory and said, okay, we can also use diplomacy, not only the jihad, not only the armed struggle. here's something of at least the same magnitude, if not a bigger magnitude that's happening. It's going to take time. It's not within a week that changes are going to take place. It's going to take some time. But in my mind, there is a chance now, and much depends on the Europeans and much depends on the Americans. If Biden is elected and adopts this policy that you were talking about, and is going to turn a blind eye to everything that the Palestinians are doing and the fact that they are paying salaries to terrorists and all of that, it will take more time. And if he behaves or Trump behaves differently, then it's going to take a shorter time for them to understand that something has happened. They were adopting this policy of waiting out the elections to see what's happening. But okay, the elections are the day after tomorrow. This policy is obsolete. So now they have to adopt a different policy, and the policy will have to be such that looks at the reality in the eye. They refuse to do that. This current leadership refuses to do that. But both the Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, both of them are refusing to do that. Somebody asked about Dahlan. I'm not sure that even Dahlan is fully aware of the intensity of the change. But I'm sure that there is a younger generation coming up. This is, I think, what Shimrit was referring to. There is a younger generation, and there is a full group of merchants, and even the labor union the trade union is of the same attitude. That listen, we are not going to make Israel disappear. This is not going to happen. We have to realize this is not going to happen. We are not going to get rid of Israel. So maybe we should at least defer this goal for a later period, and for the time being, focus on improving our living conditions. And the more we shall hear these voices inside the Palestinian Authority and inside the Palestinian community, the better chances are that we shall be able to move forward. And the more peace we shall have with the Arabs, there's more pressure going to be put on the Palestinians to think again about their position. And this is what we have to focus in the coming period after the election, to put this pressure on the Palestinians.
Because, you know, I mean, what's interesting, Shimrit, from what you said, I mean, it just sounded so, you know, 1990s, right? I mean, you have the Hamas on the one hand, and are they going to be Arafat's heir, or, you know, is this going to be the heir? And he's got the terrorist past, so that gives him legitimacy, and and he knows how to suck money out of other people to pay for his light bills, so he's got that going. I mean, it's like nothing. I mean, this was the model, you know, for the Palestinian Authority all along: be corrupt, be whatever, you know, keep your powder dry for as long as you want money from the Jews or from whomever, and then when you're feeling good, you start shooting again. And then go back and do it over and over again. And so that was sort of what you were describing. The thing that's striking to me is that you're not describing you're not hearing anything new. I mean, it all just sounds like the same old. You're saying that the Abraham Accords happened, and from what you're looking at and the information you're getting, it doesn't matter. Well, first of all, Caroline, the 90s are making a comeback. So I think, and generally speaking, I don't think that the process was vast enough, the Abraham Accords. It did not reach Saudi Arabia. And if there won't be a second term of Trump, then it will probably stop there. So in terms of penetrating deep into the Palestinian conversation, it's not there yet. Simply not there yet. You know, if 4 more years of this, maybe something would have changed. I do think that the Palestinians see their path as a long path. And their appetite for radical changes, by the way, that I think it goes as well to Israelis. And I think, you know, a side note, if you look on our side, the secret of Netanyahu spending so much time in power
is exactly that people are very reluctant to huge experiments, war or peace. And he embodied the stability and just the heavy machine that is not, jumping up and down and trying to radically change the scenario. I think in terms of the Palestinians and their thoughts pattern, and I think that it's really worthwhile to spend our time looking at the conversation, because, for example, the shift in public opinion in the Arab world that allowed the Abraham Accords started with the conversation. For the last decade, there has been a huge shift in what was allowed to say and not allowed to say. It started with the Arab Spring, and then the changes in Egypt and Saudi Arabia with MBS, and so on and so forth. You can see that there are seeds of new thought, especially among Palestinian younger generation, especially people that are abroad in DC, think tanks, etc., or Europe. But that's on one end. And on the other hand, you see radical attempts to mobilize the Palestinians into, for example, unity under the flag of resistance. Let's redefine our purpose as liberating Palestine, as Mukawama, as BDS, boycotting Israel, not give in to the logic of Oslo and Madrid and Kerry and yet another round of failed negotiations with the new administration, and just try to reshape our political scenario. For example, there is a new idea of Hamas and Fatah running together in a joint list for parliamentary election. This is really far-fetched, but just the fact that they are discussing it, it's just like the Republicans and the Democrats will run under one ticket. It's unbelievable, given the fact that, again, we are talking about almost two different societies by now after 12 years of separation, total separation. So I think that there are, seeds of people that are trying to challenge the thinking and trying to realign the Palestinians or the Palestinian Authority is usually aligned with Egypt, used to be Saudi Arabia, Gulf countries, Jordan, etc. What we see in the recent year or so, and more so in recent months, is pivot to Turkey and Qatar by the PA, which are usually the sponsors of Hamas, being the umbrella of the Muslim Brotherhood. So we see this kind of, I wouldn't say pivot, but flirtation with Erdogan and Qatar, and not finding their place entirely within the general map of rivalries in the Middle East. So again, this is a process. But what I'm saying is that the Palestinians are very slow, and this current leadership is very conservative in how it moves. And if there will be a Biden administration and some sense or reassurance by the administration that things going back to normal, not dramatic normal, not Obama normal, not negotiations, and the people in Biden's national security environment are saying, we are not going to attempt a final status negotiations. We are not there. We understand that things changed dramatically, and we don't want to fail. And of course, we don't have the leverage. But if they are going to reinstate the assets that they used to have in 2016, representation in Washington, money is flowing again. UNRWA, i.e. the refugees issue, is not being shaken. And the Palestinian Authority is being recognized and honored as the representation of the Palestinian people, meeting with US representatives, even maybe an invitation to the White House. That will be enough. That will be a breath of fresh air for them. And I think that this is more than they can hope for in the near future. Because as we, this is why we are here to discuss, they are not in a position to reshape their political future. They are just waiting for the day after. So in the meantime,
I see that Moti is shaking his head.
Look.
I guess you don't agree with her. And let me just to bring it back. We started this thing with the question of the PA after Mahmoud Abbas, but it's also after the Abraham Accords, whether Abbas leaves or not. And Shimrit doesn't seem to think that they want anything except for things to go back to normal. Where's your dispute? What are you looking at?
Let me give you one clue by which to look at this question. In my humble view, the main axis here is the axis of legitimacy. Who has the legitimacy to do anything on the ground? When Arafat came, he succeeded to raise the expectations of all the people, and he had a great legitimacy. But 26 years later, this legitimacy which the PLO had in the head of the Palestinian people is actually almost nullified. Today, everybody looks at the PLO and its Palestinian Authority as nothing more than money provider, job provider, and I think not much more than this. They lost all the credentials, they lost all the legitimacy, and this is what we should bear in mind. Whoever tries to resuscitate this dead body politic does the same mistake as the Israeli government did in 1993. This organization had some years of, I would say, facelift, if this is a good expression in this context, but it lost everything. And what you hear from now from the people on the ground, and this is exactly this. Whatever we do with this, it will be only resuscitation. How do I know? For a long time already, we know that once Mahmoud Abbas leaves the arena in a way or another, there will be like 4 or 5 groups which might start fighting on the whatever has to be, of the government. Mahmoud Al-Alul, Tawfiq Tirawi, Jibril Rajoub, Dakhlan could be also part of this, and Majid Faraj, the guy who is today in charge of the intelligence. This is the fate of an illegitimate entity where people are fighting for the government, shooting each other. All these people which I mentioned, every one of them is accumulating people, weapons, ammunition, money, and gangs to work for them. And this is what I mean by an entity which became totally illegitimate. This is one thing. This is why we shouldn't do anything in order to keep it. This is one thing. Second thing about Hamas in Gaza, if to follow what I say, what is the legitimacy? Do they have legitimacy? Hamas, which is a big question, because if they do, maybe we can base the Gazan state on them. There is one of the ways how to judge if a government has a legitimacy is to see if their policemen are walking in the streets with weapons or not. The PA are walking with weapons. Why? Because they are afraid. In Gaza, they don't go with weapons. Means in Gaza, the policeman knows in the street that nothing will happen to him as somebody who represents the authority. And this is very important. These signs, we have to open our eyes and to understand the culture of these societies, because these things are obvious to them. We don't see this because we think from an Israeli point of view. We think with our mentality and our values and whatever we think. We miss what happens there because we don't think in the way which these people think. And this is why the more we try to shape frameworks and to work according to their culture, rather than imposing on them our culture, this actually increases the chances of success. Unfortunately, the whole PA was built by people who understood nothing about the culture of the Middle East. And this is why they built something which could work for a little while, as long as the terrorist was leading it. But when it comes to daily life and to make peace with us, it is totally impossible.
So let me ask you, Yossi, we have very key interests in Judea and Samaria that were very much embodied in the sovereignty plan that has been put on the side for now in order to pursue the normalization agreements. And so sort of in this vein and looking towards the Palestinians, I think one of our participants actually asked this question, and I think that it's a really good question to leave out there and at least start with you and see how much time we have left. But, how do you see us, first of all, in the normalization issues? Are our ties with the Palestinians normal? And if they're not normal, is there a plan? Should we try to see are the Palestinians interested in having more normal relations with us or joining the Abraham Accords? Would that be something that we could do in conjunction with applying our sovereignty to the areas that were delineated under the sovereignty plan? Is this something, do you think that this is a possible way forward to try to encompass the Abraham Accords and the sovereignty plans in sort of bilateral talks with whomever in the Palestinian areas?
I don't think that the current Palestinian leadership is able in any way to join the Abraham Accords. Their life was spent on their commitment to annihilate the state of Israel. So normalizing relations with the state of Israel.
Can we ignore them? Can we just ignore them and whoever wants to talk?
We are ignoring them. We are moving forward towards peace, ignoring them. But in the Palestinian territories themselves, change should come from within the Palestinians.
Right.
And it's not we cannot tell the Palestinians what to think. We can have some impact and influence on the way they think, but we cannot tell them from now on, you should think this way. No, this is not going to work. Right now, people who can tell them things like that, like the Arabs are trying to tell them. Unfortunately, the Europeans are not trying to tell them. This is a big problem. I'm not sure about what's going to be the message you're going to get from the Americans. It depends, of course, on the result of the elections. But there's no guarantee that the message is going to be, listen, why won't you change? And I don't think that Abu Mazen can change. I can tell you, I tried so many times to convince the Abu Mazen's leadership to adopt a different policy. It was in vain. But I think the context in which they are working has changed to the extent they have to rethink about their position. Because look, in 2016, until 2016, and even later, the major issue on the table was whether Israel is going to be able to sustain the status quo that was portrayed as dangerous because it is going to lose its identity as a Jewish and democratic state, and or should it run back to and withdraw to the 67 lines, which are even more dangerous, but people said it's better than endangering the identity of a Jewish and democratic state. That was the issue until 2016, at least. Today, the issue is different. Today, the issue that the Palestinians have to understand, whether they like it or not. The issue is whether we stick to the status quo and move forward with peace with the Arab world, or we extend our sovereignty to those areas that are designated as going to be under Israeli sovereignty in the Trump plan. So this is the debate. There's no way to convince Israel to go back to 67 lines after it made peace with the UAE and is going to make peace with more Arab states. This is a totally different situation. So the Palestinians have to swallow it, to digest it. It's going to take time. But eventually there's going to be some people in the Palestinian state who say, well, we were committed to destroying Israel before in 36, 39, or destroying the Yishuv at the time. And we were rejecting the partition plan in 47. And we were fighting the Jews throughout the 72 years from then. What are the achievements we had? And you know, they have this map that in which the Palestine is disappearing slowly. It's these are the results, not because Israeli policy, because your policy. So it's time for the Palestinians to rethink about it. And I think the most important thing in this respect is gaining more and more powers telling them that. And I expect the most important thing that the focus of Israeli policy should be on adding the Saudi Arabia to this deal. If the Saudis join in, and we all heard Bandar Ben Sultan in his interview, it was very clear to the Palestinians. Listen, we lost any faith and any expectations from you. It's the more the Palestinians hear it, they want to. As Shimrit said, they try to ignore it. They don't refer to it too much. But it's not true. They hear it well. They understand the message. They don't like it, but they understand the message. And we should, of course, it's going to be easier to send this message under Trump second term than under Biden, because as Shimrit said, it's right. It's going to do some steps that will mitigate the pressure. But still, that should be the main course that we should adopt. And I hope that eventually this is going to make the Palestinians go through some thinking about their future, and the younger generation will come. The older generation, the current leadership is a waste of time.
Okay, I think we are going to have to end soon also because my kids are going crazy upstairs and I don't know what's happening. But Moti, let me just ask you, you know, we have...
Let me just give you one comment. Yeah. I wish I could share Yossi's optimism about the Biden administration if he wins. In my humble view, the Biden and Harris administration will only be a cover, because the one who will run the foreign policy, at least this in the Middle East, will be no other than Barack Hussein Obama. He is going to be the advisor. He is going to, whether officially or not, and let me tell you, he will get rid of everything which the administration, which is finishing, achieved. He will jeopardize everything. He will cancel everything. He will work day and night in order to nullify any achievement which Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Bahrain and Sudan, everything. This is what I'm afraid of. And we, Israel, should really get ready to this situation, because I think that he was, these 4 years, he was very deeply offended by Trump, and could be for good reason. When he comes back, he will just kick everything out. And we should be very... So
well, I think let me just jump in here, Sokin. You know, I think that alarmism is probably well placed right now, just looking at the state of the Democratic Party vis-a-vis Israel and Jewish people more generally. I think that you're seeing a Corbynization of the party, certainly at the grassroots level. But I also think that it's important to bear in mind that Israel's ties with the UAE and with Sudan, not with Sudan, but with also strategic ties with Egypt under Sisi and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia began under the Obama administration as a response and as a defensive mechanism towards dealing with his embrace of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas.
In my mind, under the Biden administration, it's going to
Iran. Right. No, so let me, but what I really want to end it with is a question about Israel. Because, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that reason that we were able to develop the normalization ties with the Abraham Accords is because we developed these strategic ties with the Sunni Arab states that were terrified of the Obama administration's foreign policy. And as a result, I'm less concerned about the destruction of those ties if you have a second Obama administration under whatever guise you want to call it. But what I'm wondering is, you know, we have core interests in Judea and Samaria. They were placed in danger when we were being, you know, coerced into trying to, you know, make a deal that was going to be dangerous to us. And so the real question that I'd like to pose to you as we close today is, how should Israel be looking at, the situation with the Palestinian Authority sort of in a state of constant instability that can grow larger after Abbas leaves or what have you, but it's not likely to be stabilized because, they're a dysfunctional society in many ways. How do we protect our interests over time? How do we secure them going forward, either under a Biden administration or under a second Trump term? So let me ask Shimrit, do you have any thoughts on that? But very briefly, I think I'd like all three of you, if you could give me sort of a closing on that point, for like a minute or two, and then I think we'll call it a night. So can you start, Shimrit, please?
Yes, I think the moment of truth will be, and we will have to be ready. And when I say ready, I mean both intelligence-wise and also be ready mentally with our preference and politically. For the day after, or literally not even the day after, the day of Abbas's departure. By the way, a departure can be a departure abroad, for example. I always thought it would be a very good indication if Abbas's children or Abbas's finances were started to flow outside of the PA. That would be a good indication of things about to end. But also, if he dies tomorrow, we have to be ready for the moment of truth. And I think the first thing that one will do is, of course, trying to block any scenario of Hamas taking over. Once you did that, then you will have two options. One is a scenario of armed struggle. There is a lot of weapons in the refugee camp, of course, the security forces, and everywhere you look around, every family, every big family, it's an entire ammunition bank, the West Bank, generally speaking. So you might have a short period of instability when various groups and leaders are trying to consolidate power. And then hopefully, and this is what, when I say hopefully, I echo the, let's say, establishment here in Israel, the prominent leaders of Fatah will share power between them. And that's not complicated, by the way, because you have 2 or 3 jobs. You have the Palestinian president, you have the head of the PA, the head of Fatah, and the head of the PLO. So there are many gifts to give in that sense, and one can be this and one can be that. So that's, yeah. In the sense of the Israeli establishment, that would be a good scenario. A bad scenario might even get to a Syrian kind of bloodbath. And in that case, we find ourselves in a very, very difficult position between a rock and a hard place. And I think nobody in the Israeli system wants to find themselves between various rival groups struggling for power. So, hopefully, in my opinion, there will be some kind of continuity in that sense. And because I think there are many ideas about what can be, or how can we reshape the West Bank. But I have to say, looking around the Middle East and seeing this kind of experiments, I would be very cautious and modest in what I want to achieve.
I see. All right, so let's just, Moti, what do you think? And we'll end with you, Yossi, just as we began the first round by going to you last. So we'll go to you last here too. So, yes, Moti.
Well, let me raise a little question. What will happen here in Israel if, let's say, the city of Hebron declares rebellion against the PA and wants to have its own entity? What is Israel going to do with this? Will Israel crash it and force the Hebronites to join the PA again? Or maybe we let them, okay, let's see what you can, talk to us and we can help you. Okay, this is a scenario which already people talk about. And this is what happens. And we are deaf, we don't hear these voices. And I'm connected with them. And you know, documents are starting going back and forth between people. And don't be surprised, Caroline and Yossi and Shimrit and Amir and whoever hears us, if one morning we wake up to hear that a city, not necessarily Hebron, declared a rebellion against the PA and they want to have their own self-government vis-a-vis with Israel, and that's all. And Israel should be prepared to such a scenario because this is, in my view, the Israeli interest as well. Because a Palestinian state will need an external enemy. Otherwise, they have no raison d'etre. And the idea that the Palestinian state will live peacefully alongside with Israel is an hallucination of the people who still follow the new Middle East of Shimon Peres. It will not happen. And because this is against the raison d'etre of this kind of a state. A state which will be a conglomerate of clans will need an external enemy. And we are the external enemy. If we want to have peace, we have to approach the local powers, the clans. Look, let me give you, just to be clear, I don't think that the Sheikh of Jabri clan in Hebron will go in the houses to distribute water bills. He will not do this. He will have clerks. Means the municipality will work as some kind of a government, while the Majlis Shura, means the parliament, will be the sheikhs. They will sit there, they will talk, and they will talk about policy, but the policy will be carried out by officials, by clerks, by people who know how to run a city, how to run a water pump or electricity. Okay,
I think we have to make it brief because we have to finish here. Amir did tell us we gotta cut our time, and I really do want to give Yossi an opportunity to just give his 2 cents before we call it a night. So if you have a last sentence, say it, or can we just maybe go to Yossi?
I'll say one short sentence. I think what we need to do is to take care of Israeli interests, and we cannot engineer how the Palestinians will act. We have some hopes, and some of these hopes will come true. That's wonderful, but we should realize we are in a long battle with the Palestinians. And it's in this situation that we are in, we should focus on widening the normalization and on taking care of our own interest in the Judea and Samaria territories and in the Jordan Valley, in strengthening the communities over there, in moving as much as we can towards more and more attributes of sovereignty, even if we cannot have full sovereignty over there because we gave some promises. And that should be our focus. And if the Palestinians end up with understanding that they lost the battle, that would be great. If the Palestinians will be ready to have those emirates, this would be great. But we shouldn't build on that. If it happens, that's great. And what we should worry about is that if Abu Mazen goes away, it will be the context of understanding that the Palestinian cause is lost, the way he envisioned it, the way he and the other leaders of the PLO and the Hamas envisioned it. And that will maybe in the long term will bring about something different. That is in my mind the things we should focus about. And of course, be ready to defend ourselves, because in the meanwhile, a lot of problems can be turned against us. All these battles amongst the Palestinians can be done with all kinds of violence against us. We should be ready for that as well.
I think this has been a really riveting thing. I think it's important to note that Habitchonistim have played a major and important role in pushing for the implementation of Israeli sovereignty over parts of Judea and Samaria. And I think that, going forward, Israel's focus, especially given the various ideas about what's actually happening in Palestinian society, in Judea and Samaria in particular, and the instability there, I think that Israel's laser focus should be on on advancing our sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. And I'll just close on one optimistic note relating to the Abraham Accords and sovereignty, because I think it's important. You know, a lot of people were saying, look, now that we've made the normalization deal with the UAE, it was made in exchange for sovereignty. But I think that one of the most notable things that happened last week was that in the wake of the civil administration's approval of, I think, 4,000 housing units in Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria, the move was met with harsh condemnation by the UN, by the EU, by the Germans, the French, the British, the Spanish, the Italians, and others, all of the usual suspects, as they said in Casablanca. But notable in their absence from the list of the condemners were not only the United States, but Bahrain and the UAE. And so I think that, you know, that silence speaks 1,000 words. And I think that going forward, whether it's a Biden administration or second Trump administration, we should really be focusing on what we have and what we need and going out and getting it. And thank you very much. Thank all of you for your really, you know, interesting and enlightening ideas about what's happening. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Couldn't agree more. And thank you. Call it a meeting. Bye to you all.
Bye.
Thank you.